See, the United States has a tendency to do this. People fly into, say in the case of Zambia, into Lusaka, walk into the president's house and say, you should do this, you should do that. It's the whole finger wagging culture. Do this, do that. The first time I came to China was the 1980s. Obviously the 1978 reforms had started, but you couldn't see anything. It was about, 6 years or 7 years after the reform era started. Things don't happen that fast. The countryside was very poor. Shanghai was not, there were no buildings like this. There was that clock tower, I think maybe that clock tower was the tallest building. I don't remember, frankly. The road out of Shanghai was a small 2-lane road. It was very much a developing country. It was familiar to me in terms of what you see. And then China made rapid advances one way or the other. Some of it was extraordinary good use of the kind of technology and science from other countries. The Chinese, the communists were able to attract science and technology, make use of it, improve the condition of expertise in the country. Now it's amazing because you go into little factories, highly skilled people working there. Where did they come from? I don't remember them. I'm not that old, but I remember a time when there was almost nobody with those skills in the country. Suddenly all these things happen, very compressed. So China has a path to modernization which is pretty unique. Now, that doesn't mean nothing can be learned from it. Lots of things can be learned from it. And I'm glad that, Xi Jinping is putting forward a number of concepts. Unite and prosper, win-win, China's path to modernization, China's model of development. At the same time, I was really quite interested in the 20th Party Congress document. It talked about China having modest prosperity. 700 million people raised out of poverty. That's fine. But now more, we've got to achieve other goals for human development and so on. So I think these are interesting formulations. The path to development, the path to modernization, unite and prosper, win-win. These are all interesting concepts. The issue is, how do we take these concepts and translate it into the reality of other countries? So if you take a country like Zambia, a very rich country because it has a lot of copper, but very poor because it has no capital. It's fundamentally in debt. Its political class is almost completely subservient to the West. They take orders from the West effectively. People are quite poor, but it's a rich country. Now what is Zambia's path to modernization? It can't be the same story as the Chinese path. I was very interested to hear what Deng Xiaoping said in 1985 to the then head of government of Ghana. He said that, you got to find your own path based on your national conditions. So I think these concepts, win-win, unite and prosper, China's path to modernization and so on, these are all very important to study. It's important to study what happened in China and what is happening in China, not to copy it, but to see if there are things that one can learn from the path to modernization. So I'm very sympathetic with this, but I also think that one of the interesting facets of the Chinese experience isn't to lecture people how to do things. I think that's very interesting and curious. Most people who have this kind of punctuated advance, so fast, you developed and so on, might get arrogant and might walk around the world saying, well, this is how you should do it. We did it like this, you should do it like that. See, the United States has a tendency to do this. People fly into, say in the case of Zambia, into Lusaka, walk into the president's house and say, you should do this, you should do that. It's the whole finger wagging culture. Do this, do that. It's interesting. Chinese have a completely different attitude. It's far more humble. I think this doesn't come from 3,000 years of China. This comes from the communist experience. And I can be pretty precise about this. Because if you had an imperial system, imperial systems aren't humble. You're an emperor. You tell your people to go and put a decree out. Your local administrators, and this is all documented in the 19th century and 18th century, administrators for the emperor go out and tell people, you got to do this. But the communists changed all that. They don't have a policy of, essentially a language of command. Do this, do that. There's a different attitude, and I kind of like the attitude. When I see Chinese officials around the world, rather than have their hands moving like that, they sort of have it by their side, and they're listening and they're happy to share their experiences, but they don't tell people what to do. So, when I hear these concepts, China's path to modernization, and, again, win-win is an interesting concept. It requires a lot of explanation because it looks simple, but it's not that simple. These are interesting because they are suggesting that, we're going to systematize a theory of how China was able to accelerate from 1949 onwards, not just 1978, but 1949. We've got to systematize our own story. That's a Chinese project. And then others can read the story, experience what's happening, and see what they can draw from it. But they have to create their own project.